Welcome to What's on the Ballot. In this episode, we're covering Question 2, Ranked Choice Voting. This is a question on the ballot for the upcoming Massachusetts state election on Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020. In your 2020 Statewide Ballot Questions booklet, you'll find a summary of this proposed law as well as the full text of the question. Also in that booklet is what your vote will do. The following is written jointly by the State Attorney General and the Secretary of the Commonwealth. A yes vote would create a system of ranked choice voting in which voters have the option to rank candidates in order of preference, and votes would be counted in rounds, eliminating candidates with the lowest votes until one candidate has received a majority. A no vote would make no change in the laws governing voting and how votes are counted. Also in your Statewide Ballot Questions booklet is a statement of fiscal consequences, written by the Executive Office of Administration and Finance. This states that this measure will likely require implementation costs for state and municipal elections officials, but because the proposed law would only apply to elections and primaries that are held on or after January 1st, 2022, the fiscal consequences of this proposed measure for state and municipal government finances are otherwise unknown. Another section in your ballot booklet includes short arguments in favor and against the proposed law. Medfield TV's executive director, Brett Poirier, conducted more in-depth interviews with representatives from both of the organizations that wrote these statements. To start off, we have short statements from each representative regarding their perspective on Question 2.
Look around you at the state of politics today. The division, the polarization. We have an increasing share of voters that don't subscribe to either party feel like they're without a voice in the voting booth. And people are looking around for solutions, and this is one that's been in use for over 100 years around the world. It's growing rapidly in popularity around the United States. It was enacted in New York City just last year, which is a jurisdiction bigger than Massachusetts. We know it works. We know how to do it. We saw what they did in Maine. The process went smoothly, and it's something that can work here as well. You can support whoever you want. You can vote your heart in the voting booth without, settling for what you might think is the lesser of two evils. And we ensure that the winner has a majority of the vote. And that's what it's about. And if people want to learn more, they can go to the website at yeson2, that's the number 2, yeson2rcv.com. And, we're looking for volunteers now. So if you like what you hear, there's all kinds of ways you can help us win.
You want to keep voting simple. Make it so it's easier for people. Don't put this burden on people so when they have to go to vote, they need to figure out who they prefer in order. I often hear the proponents say, it's simple as ranking your favorite ice cream flavors, vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, mint, whatever it may be. And that's kind of a funny thing. I laugh at it because what you're asking voters is, you're talking to voters who have never tried any of these flavors. And what you're saying is go try all these flavors, then rank them. The problem is, while that may sound good in theory, the average person doesn't have time, the bandwidth, or the interest to go try all those flavors, to go identify each candidate running, figure out their policies, and then rank them. So that's really more of in context whenever you hear the ice cream flavor ranking. It's really about people just don't have the time or the interest to go and study each candidate. So why don't you just make it simple? Give one person, one vote, and call it a day.
The following is the full interview with Greg Dennis, Policy Director for Yes on 2, speaking in favor of Question 2.
I am here with Greg Dennis with the Yes on 2 campaign. Greg, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your coalition.
Sure. So I'm Greg Dennis. I'm the Policy Director for the Yes on 2 campaign. And we're comprised of people from all parties, from Democrats, Republicans, Independents. Some of our co-chairs include former Democratic Governor Deval Patrick, former Republican Governor Bill Weld, Tanisha Sullivan from the Boston NAACP, lots of people from all sides, all coming together, uniting behind this reform, ranked choice voting, because we all understand that there's some pretty serious problems with politics in the country today. I don't think there's anybody watching this who would say we have a healthy and well-functioning political system today. The truth is we have a system that promotes division, not consensus. It's a system that lets candidates win without a majority of the vote. It's a system that shuts out diverse and independent voices. And it's a system in which many of us feel pressured to vote for the lesser of two evils. And, ranked choice voting question 2 is not going to fix every problem with politics today, but it is one simple, fair, and easy thing we can do right now to help make things better.
Now, what is question 2 for people who may not have a total idea of what's going on? Let me know what question 2 is and what the issue was that brought question 2 to our ballots.
Sure. So question 2 is for ranked choice voting. In most elections today, as you know, you can only choose one candidate. In ranked choice voting, you can still choose one candidate as you would today, but you have the added option of backup choices, a second choice, a third choice, and so on, as many or as few as you like. And what that means is if your first choice doesn't have a shot at winning, your vote counts instantly towards your backup choice instead. And we ultimately elect somebody that has a majority of support. So you can feel free to support an underdog candidate in the race without throwing your vote away. New and diverse voices are encouraged to enter the race and compete. And candidates have an incentive to reach out beyond their base, to talk to more voters, to build that majority, and that creates for more civil and issue-oriented campaigns.
Now, Greg, on the side of someone voting, what would this process look like? What was something that they should be aware of what ranked choice would look like on the ballot?
Sure. So the voting system we have today is called plurality voting. It's an old voting method that's not used in much of the world today, but we're stuck with it here in Massachusetts and much of the United States. And the typical plurality ballot is you have one column of bubbles, and you fill in the bubble in that column for the candidate you like best. Although often you feel pressured to vote for somebody you don't like best, but you fill in the bubble at any rate for one candidate. So the first column, you're in a ranked choice voting ballot, you're going to have a column for first choice that looks like that, but then additionally a column for second choice, a column for third choice, and so on, up to the number of candidates that are running. And you fill in your bubble for your first choice, and as long as you do that, your ballot's good. Your ballot counts. It's not spoiled in any way. So if you just vote plurality style today, you still have a valid ballot. But then in the column next to that, you can, if you want, mark a second choice, and then next to that, a third choice, and so on.
So it would be just like as we normally look at it, top to bottom in order of incumbent, and then by alphabetical order. And then as you vote, you're going to select, 1 up here, then 2's down here, and 3's up here, and you're going to actually just bubble in your options essentially as in columns.
Yep. Yeah, the candidates in the same order they're in today. The first column is going to look like the column of bubbles you see today. It's just next to that to the right, you have a column for second choice and third choice, and you bubble in as many or as few as you want. And as long as you have, a first choice picked, your ballot's good.
Now, one of the things that we talked to the no side as well, and we looked up, just like everyone else, we have the voter information guide as it's going through. And so it does do a good job breaking down the yes and the no, reasoning. And one of the things is that they say that it's confusing for people, that this is going to be a confusing process for people to grasp, as they'll have to understand and know more about the candidates. They'll have to research more. They might have to do more. Is that something that you've considered in your group?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard those arguments. Those arguments have been going on for a while now. 20 years ago, there was one city in the United States using ranked choice voting. Now there's 24, the state of Maine. It's been used around the world for over 100 years. And so we know that those arguments just are not true in practice. Ranking things is something natural we do every day. I take my 5-year-old to go get ice cream. If they don't have his favorite flavor, is he going home with no ice cream? No, you bet not. He's asking for his second choice. And if they're out of his second choice, he's asking for his third choice. So the idea of having backup options is something very natural, something we do every day. And it's something we can do on the ballot as well.
Now, the flip side of this, now, once I fill out my ballot, I hand it across the table. What happens to my ballot? How is that calculated? And can you tell me about the process? There's an elimination process essentially as it goes through. So can you tell me about, once I hand in my ballot, what is that ballot? What happens to that?
Right. So, you fill in the bubbles as you fill in the bubbles in the voting booth today. And then in most cities and towns, you feed the ballot through that scanner machine as you do today. There's some towns hand count, and that's fine. You put it in the ballot box for hand counting later, just as you would today. And election night is going to look pretty similar. So the people that count the ballots, whether it's by machine or by hand, depending on your city or town, are going to do the same thing, except they're just going to count the first choices on the ballot, just that first column in your precinct. And they're going to report the first choices for each candidate on election night. And if any candidate has a majority of those first choices on election night, that candidate wins. More than 50%, they win. The difference comes is if no candidate has a majority of the first choices. If that happens, then the Secretary of State gathers the rankings from the cities and towns, and he does an instant runoff, essentially. He does this elimination process where the last place candidate is eliminated. Everybody that voted for that last place candidate has their vote instead counted towards their second choice. And you look, if there's a majority, you continue that until you're down to 2 candidates. And when you're down to 2, you know that one candidate's going to have a majority of those votes. And so that's how it works.
And so if my first choice candidate gets through that round, is it my second choice? Those votes then get counted? Like, how does that actually, the first, second, and third choice, when do I know that my vote for a certain round is going to be taken into consideration?
So your vote for your second choice is only counted if your first choice is out of the running, if your first choice comes in.
Oh, okay.
So your vote stays with your first choice as long as possible. So you should never fear ranking. You should never be concerned that by ranking a second choice, you're somehow hurting or diluting the oomph behind your first choice, because you're not. It's like a runoff, right? So some places have runoff elections. You have one election, and if your candidate makes it to the next round, you show up again and you go vote for that candidate again. This has some of the benefits of the runoff. You get to that majority winner, but you get it in one trip to the polls. So your vote stays with your first choice as long as they're successful, as long as they have enough support. But if at some point they can't win, then your vote goes to your second choice if you have one.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense then. So now the actual machines that are doing this, the machine that you're putting in, it says in this that there's a central location that the ballots will be sent to. So is that something that once the 50% is not calculated, right? The candidate doesn't get 50%, ballots get packaged up and sent to a central location in Massachusetts?
Yeah, not necessarily ballots, but the data of the rankings on the ballots, usually just the data from the rankings. So, the voting machines scan the ballots and store the data of what they scanned. That's how they print out the results at the end of the night. So that data instead gets collected into some central location. It might just be the Secretary of State's office, but it's wherever he wants to set up shop. And so he takes those rankings and presses a button, and it computes, who the majority winner is. And all that data is, as it's done around the country, is made public online. So if anybody wants to double check the count, they can. And a lot of people like to, because published online, and all these researchers and hobbyists around the world download that immediately and double check the result and run all kinds of interesting analyses about what the public felt about the various candidates.
So a couple things that the No campaign brought up was, one of the ideas was that a lot of towns may not have machines that would accommodate ranked choice voting, and that could create a problem for counting the ballots in a town. Is that something that is a problem? Is that something that, some machines may not be able to handle ranked choice?
By the time the ballot initiative goes into effect in 2022, it's 2 years away, we believe that nearly all the machines in the state that do not support ranked choice voting today will have been replaced. Today, you have a number of cities and towns with machines, all modern voting machines, including all machines authorized for purchase in this state by the Secretary of State, support ranked choice voting. We're just talking about old, discontinued machines that do not support it, but those machines are on their way out. for a whole variety of reasons, including they pose just a security risk by their mere existence that they're still in use. So those are already on their way out and will probably be decertified by the Secretary of State in the next year or two anyway. And if ranked choice voting creates a little bit of an incentive for some of the stragglers, towns to, upgrade their equipment, we'd be better off anyway from a security and usability perspective. So I think it might only be a handful of machines we're left with by the time the first ranked choice voting race takes place.
Makes sense. Now, one of the things that I brought up as well, because I think as a resident reading it, it can be alarming when you see certain wording. So in this, the statement of fiscal consequences says that the costs are otherwise unknown. Is that like a clerical thing, or what does that mean when they're saying that the costs are unknown for 2022?
Yeah, that's not something the campaign puts together. That's something that either the Attorney General or the Secretary of State put together. And I don't know, I think it's a clerical thing or a formality that they put on for ballot initiatives of this kind.
2022's budget hasn't been made yet, so.
Right, something like that. I don't know the mechanics by which and the rules by which they choose the wording for that. But we know, when they did it in Maine, initially there were these astronomical estimates of it's going to cost $11 million to use ranked choice voting. Then somehow that got down to $1 million. And then ultimately in 2018, it cost them $100,000 to add ranked choice voting. So it was 0.001% or something of the main budget. So if you scale that up to Massachusetts size, it's going to be about the same percentage of the budget. We're nearly there in terms of all the machines supporting it. If we have to replace a handful of them, so be it. And there's going to be a little bit of money on some education effort just to, let people know it's happening.
So a couple more questions for you, Greg. And I know I don't want to take up too much of your time, but one of the questions.
All the time in the world. You can do that.
Right.
I love talking.
So one of the main points of your coalition is that this is going to help with big money corruption, and this is going to help independents and lower funded candidates get votes. How is it that ranked choice voting will actually address that? How is that something that big money won't be able to squander the little guy anymore?
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't want to oversell it, right? Money is going to play a prominent role in politics with ranked choice voting. We're just talking about limiting or attenuating the effect a little bit. Right now we have a system that tells candidates they shouldn't run because they're going to play the spoiler. It does not encourage new voices into the race. Under ranked choice voting, it's a system that encourages new people to run, encourages independent voices to run. Doesn't matter if you're a traditional candidate or you have a lot of money, you're the type of candidate that looks or thinks exactly like the candidates that we're used to seeing. And so, more voices are encouraged to get in. And it doesn't matter if you have a big bank account, you can run without being that spoiler, without splitting that vote. And that limits the degree to which money controls the political conversation. So new ideas can be injected into the debate without them necessarily having a lot of money behind them.
I want to talk about, because it's going to be fresh on everyone's mind, I talked about it with the No as well, is this past 4th Congressional Mass District race. And I think that this is the race that everybody looked at and said, almost every one of those candidates came out and said ranked choice voting could have changed this election. And I believe even the candidates that were left, the last two, Jake Auchincloss and Jesse Mermel, are both supporters of this as well. I believe Jake Auchincloss is.
He is. He's a big supporter.
Yeah, and so the two of them are both huge supporters of this as well. And so tell me, how would ranked choice voting have affected that congressional race? How do you see that ranked choice voting could affect races like that one?
Well, it would have been a dramatic improvement to the 4th Congressional District race. And this has been a perennial problem in Massachusetts elections. The 3rd Congressional District race in 2018 was won with 23% of the vote. We've had these races over and over again like this. It's just, as ranked choice voting has increased in prominence, we're doing a better job of sort of connecting the dots. But the 4th Congressional District race, first of all, you have 9 candidates in the race. So a lot of voters are going to the voting booth thinking, well, I can choose one, but who's viable? who's got a shot? I don't want to throw my vote away on somebody that's going to, end up in single digits. So they have to strategize and they have to think, what do the polls say? What's the likelihood of this? And, to go through that strategic thinking, I don't think is conducive to, a healthy political discussion. So with ranked choice voting, you can go into the voting booth and just vote your conscience, like say who you honestly prefer first and who you honestly prefer second. If your first choice, if it turns out they don't have a chance to win, well, then you get your second choice, right? And they don't have a chance to win, then you get your third choice. So, right off the bat, it's improving that voter experience because they can vote their heart in the voting booth. Then, candidates, we saw 2 candidates in that race drop out of the race because they thought they were going to be the spoiler in the race. With ranked choice voting, they wouldn't have need to drop out. They could have stayed in the race without splitting the vote, while giving voters that choice and hearing their voice. And by the time they had dropped out, thousands of votes had already been cast for them by mail. So those votes were wasted before the counting had even begun. Under ranked choice voting, if a candidate drops out, well, you probably got a backup choice there, just in case they do, and so your backup choice is counted. And ultimately, the winner won with 22% of the vote, so 78% of voters chose someone else. And opinions differ on whether he could have captured a majority of the vote, but we ultimately can't know for sure. But the fact that we don't know, whether the person we're electing represents a majority of the voters is the problem. We need to know that, and we need to be sure of that.
Certainly on the election day, that's something that, I know it's definitely in that race, people will say, oh, my person didn't win. The majority of people are saying my person didn't win. But at least now you can say, oh, my second person won or my third person won, rather than saying my candidate didn't win. So I definitely see where that could have helped. So the last part, I guess my last question for you is essentially just if you could sum up for people who are getting their ballots in November and they're going to vote, why should they vote on yes on 2?
Yeah, well, I mean, look around you at the state of politics today, the division, the polarization. We have an increasing share of voters that don't subscribe to either party feel like they're without a voice in the voting booth. And people are looking around for solutions. And this is one that's been in use for over 100 years around the world. It's growing rapidly in popularity around the United States. It was enacted in New York City just last year, which is a jurisdiction bigger than Massachusetts. We know it works. We know how to do it. We saw what they did in Maine. The process went smoothly. And it's something that can work here as well. You can support whoever you want. You can vote your heart in the voting booth without, settling for what you might think is the lesser of 2 evils. And we ensure that the winner has a majority of the vote. And that's what it's about. And if people want to learn more, they can go to the website at yeson2, that's the number 2, yeson2rcv.com. And, we're looking for volunteers now. So if you like what you hear, there's all kinds of ways you can help us win.
That's fantastic. Greg, thank you so much for sitting down with us. I think that the 2 questions this year are very important questions, and we really appreciate you coming on and helping us clear the air for our voters here in Medfield and in the area, really.
It was great to be here.
Thank you so much.
More information regarding Yes on 2 can be found online at yeson2rcv.com. Next up, we have the full interview with Paul Craney, board member of the Massachusetts Fiscal Alliance, speaking in opposition to question 2.
Paul Craney of the Massachusetts Fiscal Alliance. Paul, tell me about your alliance and introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Paul Diego Craney, and I helped start Massachusetts Fiscal Alliance. Right now, I'm a board member of the organization. Mass Fiscal Alliance advocates for lower taxes, less spending, and more government transparency at the State House. And the reason why I'm before you today on ranked choice voting, because that doesn't sound like taxes, spending, or transparency at the State House, is because this time last year, the legislature had a hearing on this as a bill. And at the time, ranked choice voting was a very new concept at the State House. And on a personal capacity, we were following it pretty closely with what happened in Maine 2 years ago. So at the hearing, we decided to bring in some experts that would offer the other point of view on ranked choice. But let me just tell your audience that ranked choice voting is not a Republican or Democrat issue. It's not even a liberal or conservative issue. It's completely nonpartisan and non-ideological. It's just a preference for how you want to elect your leaders. And right now we have a system, ranked choice is another system. There's frankly a lot of other systems out there that are actually being used in Massachusetts as well. So at the hearing, we brought in a guy named Lee Goodman, who is a well-known lawyer. The reason we brought him in is because he was appointed by President Obama to serve on the Federal Election Commission, which is the country's highest campaign finance board. And he had a unanimous confirmation vote in the United States Senate. So he's very well regarded from both Republicans and Democrats. And in his own professional capacity as a lawyer, once he came off of the Federal Election Commission, 2 years ago, he, as a lawyer, went to federal court to overturn a ranked choice voting decision that happened in Maine. So he went through the process of a court hearing, and obviously when you go through that, you get really familiar with the topic you're in court for. So we had Lee come in and he gave the other perspective, a perspective that at the time, not a lot of people were thinking about. And hopefully now people will start thinking about it. But I will acknowledge that ranked choice voting has some admirable goals that it's trying to fix. There's no doubt. Taking away spoiler candidates, taking away negative campaigning, striving so that more people's votes are counted toward a majority pool to elect your leaders. Those are all good things. And I will go through those things, if you like, right now, for why ranked choice comes up a little bit short on some of those. One is the spoiler candidate. You know, I am conservative. I am right of center. I have a lot of friends who are also Democrats, liberals, but I also have a lot of friends, as you can imagine, that are conservative and Republican. Without any doubt, I have some friends right now who are going to be voting in the November election. Under a ranked choice system, they could vote for, let's say, for president of the United States, they could vote for a libertarian candidate. And on their second ballot, vote for President Trump. Most likely, the libertarian's not going to outperform the president, and their vote will eventually count for the president of the United States. Under ranked choice, that's a great example of why you can vote for a non-spoiler candidate. What gets hard and tricky under ranked choice is if you look at that 4th congressional district in the primary, which happened in September, or if you remember this time last year in the presidential primary for president, there were about 20 Democrats running for president on the Democratic side, of which the vast majority were very serious, polished candidates that deserved a lot of attention. You had governors, you have senators, you have well-known members of Congress. Under those circumstances, it's very hard to figure out if there's any spoiler candidates. And that becomes the problem. So again, the Trump versus Libertarian, you know, that's not a spoiler candidate. But when you start looking at fields of candidates where they're all very strong, then that's when ranked choice becomes a problem. And I'll get back to that in a minute. The second one is negative campaigning. You'll hear the proponents say ranked choice voting will deter negative campaigning. And in certain circumstances, I think that's true. But negative campaigning will happen in any election system that is presented. It's part of politics. And I'll give you a great example of how it happened 2 years ago in Maine. In Maine, they had the first congressional election for ranked choice voting. The Republican congressman in the Northern District, on election night, he won. He got 49.5% of the vote. Unfortunately, he didn't get 50%. That's a very close election, but he won with over 2,500 votes past the second place winner. In that election, there was 4 candidates, a Republican, a Democrat, and 2 independents. One of the independents only campaigned on legalizing marijuana. The other candidate that was an independent campaigned on going against the Republican. So that candidate said, vote for me. And if you don't vote for me, vote in your second ballot for the Democrat to defeat the Republican. Well, there's a ranked choice situation in which you have negative campaigning. And so there's just no way to avoid negative campaigning. I will acknowledge there are certain situations where we can think of where negative campaigning could be less so under ranked choice, but it, you know, to make the claim that it won't happen is just not true. It will happen. It's just a new way of doing a negative campaigning. But the biggest problem with ranked choice voting, the biggest problem of all, is something called exhausted ballots. The only way for ranked choice voting to come out with a fake majority of people casting votes for a preferred candidate is through exhausting ballots. And all that means is Go back to a year ago where you had about 20 Democrats running in the presidential primary. You had Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, many other candidates. Massachusetts actually had Seth Moulton running for president at the time. I mean, we were abundant with candidates. So under ranked choice voting, the pressure that is put on the voter is unfair. And here's what I mean. Under ranked choice voting, you have to, as a voter, determine who are the last two candidates standing in order for your vote to count for the final winner. So unless you can determine who the last two people are standing, your vote gets exhausted. Your vote gets discarded. So what they do is they discard votes along the process through the rounds in order to lower the amount of votes that are counted to find who is the majority with the smaller amount of votes that were casted originally on election day. That's how ranked choice voting works. So again, go back to the Donald Trump versus Libertarian candidate. It's pretty obvious Donald Trump's going to beat a Libertarian. Your vote will count on the second round for that, for the president. But if you have situations like you did in the 4th Congressional Primary District in September, where all those candidates were strong, and like we did last year in the Democrat primary, where probably the vast majority would be considered pretty strong, it's almost impossible for a voter to determine who are the last two standing to ensure that your ballot is counted for determining who actually wins. And the other problem with ranked choice voting, that what I just described was voter vote exhaustion. The other problem is overvoting. And we've seen this happen throughout. It happened in the Maine election where, again, the congressman lost, even though he won election night, but he lost to ranked choice voting. And all this means is when you go to the ballot, you see, let's say 5 candidates running. You're supposed to rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The problem is there will be people that will show up that on their first vote, they'll vote for 2, 3, 4 candidates. Instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they'll do 1 through 4 in the first column. Their vote is discarded because they were confused, they messed it up. So you're going to have that, and that's just, that's 2 forms of disenfranchising voters, through voter exhaustion to find out who is the majority pick by lowering the amount of votes, and then just by voter confusion, by filling out the ballot the wrong way. So in my opinion, ranked choice voting has some benefits, but the costs outweigh the benefits, and it's just too much cost. At the end of the day, you want to keep voting simple, make it so it's easier for people. Don't put this burden on people so when they have to go to vote, they need to figure out who they prefer in order. I often hear the proponents say, it's simple as ranking your favorite ice cream flavors, vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, mint, whatever it may be. And that's kind of a funny thing. I laugh at it because what you're asking voters is, you're talking to voters who have never tried any of these flavors. And what you're saying is go try all these flavors, then rank them. The problem is, while that may sound good in theory, the average person doesn't have time, the bandwidth, or the interest to go try all those flavors, to go identify each candidate running, figure out their policies, and then rank them. So that's really more of in context whenever you hear the ice cream flavor ranking. It's really about people just don't have the time or the interest to go and study each candidate. So why don't you just make it simple? Give one person, one vote, and call it a day. So, those are some of the problems with ranked choice. The other last thing is there will be people who go to vote who will see many candidates, and they may just want to vote for one candidate, or they may want to vote against someone, meaning they see, let's say 5 candidates, and they see there's one person on there that they really despise. They will not vote for that person under any circumstance. Well, with ranked choice voting, you need to rank all of your candidates to give yourself the best opportunity to ensure that your vote is counted depending on who are the last 2 people standing. But the problem is, when you go to their vote, you may only want to vote for 1 or 2, or you will not vote for certain candidates because you despise them. You could do that still through ranked choice, but there's likelihood of your vote actually counting at the final tally gets reduced dramatically.
Now, how is this going to be calculated? I guess in my mind, I was looking at the ranked choice voting. Who is actually going to be doing the counting at the end of this? Because obviously now, when I vote for either one candidate or another, there's a ballot, it gets slipped in and it gets counted. How does ranked choice work? Is someone going to actually have to do the math for them? Or how does that actually, what's the process there?
Brett, I've done dozens of interviews. You're the second person to ask me that question. It's a great question. No one asks the logistic issue of how does this actually work. When you go to vote currently, you put your ballot into a machine. The machine counts your vote, saying that you have voted. They don't actually open the ballot to determine who you voted for. That's done on election night. With ranked choice, and that's done at your town level. With ranked choice voting, no one's asking that question. How does it actually look on election night? So under ranked choice, you would go vote in your town. Every town's ballot would be then sent to a central location, I'm assuming in Boston, where there it would be counted. And the reason why it would have to be sent to one central location is because we have statewide ballots, so you have to put them all together. So what we've always liked in Massachusetts is that kind of local control of things. We have town meeting. It's very unique. We're giving up some of those rights. We're giving up that freedom for our local people counting our ballots. So your ballot would be tossed with the rest of the other towns and cities across Massachusetts all together and counted. And you're right. People won't be sitting there counting the ballots like we're used to. I don't know if you've ever gone through a recount, but you have people together, usually from the different parties, looking over each other's shoulders, counting ballots when it's very close. And that's great because that's transparency. You want that. You want both sides to say, I'm looking at this together and we're coming to the same conclusions, and it's in broad daylight. Under ranked choice voting, all these ballots get sent to one central location and a computer software system counts your ballots. That's how it's done. So there's a lot of issues with that, with people who like the old way that's worked very well for hundreds of years, where there's a lot of transparency. You saw that in the main election that I mentioned, where it was a very close race. A lot was on the line. Because it was close, there was a lot of scrutiny with those ballots. And what happened in Maine was that you found ballots that were all brought to a central location. Some of these locks were open. Some of the doors that are supposed to keep these ballots shut were ajar, and people started to distrust the system, and rightly so. I'm not making the claim that ballots were tampered, but the issue is that it was taking out of the local control, where at least you have some oversight. In many Massachusetts towns, I know my town of North Andover, both parties, the Republican and Democrat Party, have basically poll watchers. And those are people who are designated by the local town parties that can show up on election night to ensure that everything is happening to satisfy both parties' interests. Under ranked choice system, we're sending everything to a central location where computer software systems count our vote. And if it's a really close election, I have no idea how they're going to separate your vote in Medfield and my vote in North Andover and recount them. But somehow, allegedly, that's going to be taken care of. Also, the voting machines in Massachusetts, I think we use 4 different voting machines. I'm not sure if each one of those models are ranked choice compliant, but that's something that people are going to have to address about changing our voting machines and who's going to pay for that. So there's a lot of logistical issues, I think, that people should be thinking about with ranked choice voting as far as how do we actually count these ballots.
Now, Paul, one of the things I do want to note, you used as examples presidential elections, which I understand most people are familiar with presidential elections. That's what, if you're going to talk about elections, that's what most people are voting for. That's what they're most comfortable with. But in this, the ballot the ballot, list that we got, it actually does say that this is not going to be used for presidential elections. It will only be used for local elections. But I do understand why you're using it, but I just want to make sure and clarify that this is not a presidential ballot that we're talking about for ranked choice.
Yeah, and that could also change down the road. I think they're trying to do that now in Maine. So for the time period we're talking about non-presidential elections. The other thing to think about that isn't often addressed is if this passes in November, the appropriate next step would be if it has to go to the courts to see if it's even constitutional. Of course, things pass on ballots. Massachusetts is not the only state, and the courts then determine if it passes muster. That's the way it kind of works in Massachusetts. The state constitution is pretty specific. It says one person, one vote. I don't know what the court would do with ranked choice. My guess is that plaintiffs would have a good opportunity to make their case before the state Supreme Court. I do know in Maine, they found that ranked choice was considered unconstitutional with their state constitution for state elections. So it's only on the federal elections in Maine. So that's also a concern is, we have to see if this is actually constitutional.
Now, I'll only ask a couple more questions. I did want to talk about the 4th Congressional District, that election specifically. Most of the candidates that ran were in favor of this ranked voter choice because they felt like if candidates or if people who were voting were ranking us, that would give us a better chance at winning, or would give us a better chance, people would be more apt to research everybody if they had to rank them. But what's your consideration? Why is the 4th Congressional District a good example why not to vote for ranked choice?
I'm so happy you brought this up because it is pretty fresh. For political activists, they're going to like ranked choice. So if you're running for office, you're probably a political activist. Maybe Donald Trump isn't because he's not a politician or whatever, but for the candidates in the 4th Congressional District, they're all political activists, so they're going to like this. For the average voter, they're not a political activist. So again, you're asking them to take on this burden of identifying all the candidates, figuring out their positions, and then asking the voter to put a preference of all the candidates. And there's no guarantee that they're going to like all the candidates. So the 4th Congressional District is great because I think I'm a bit of a political activist. I follow this stuff pretty closely. I'm in your show right now. I can't name all the candidates that ran for that office, let alone tell you their positions. I'm struggling with it. I think that's normal. I think people get a little exhausted with this. So imagine that scenario, but compounded for every election you're dealing with in Massachusetts. It's quite a burden. And at the end of the day, do we want to put more confusion, more burden on people, especially in 2020? It's been a kind of rough year for people. Or do we want to keep it simple? I like the simple process. Now, if we want to have a conversation about how we can make the current system better, there are other options out there. Remember, this is a decision of, do the benefits outweigh the costs or the costs outweigh the benefits? In my personal opinion, the costs outweigh the benefits. I think there's other systems, voting systems, that will alleviate some of these problems. Ranked choice voting is often called instant runoff voting. The voter is required to instantly do a runoff election. There's also another program called Runoff Elections. So we have that in Boston. We have that across the country. And all that means is, say you have 5 candidates, 10 candidates running for office. It's very hard to predict that any of them will get the majority vote. So the top 2 will then have another election afterwards. That's a runoff election. I like that idea. That allows the candidates to re-engage the voters, give them another opportunity to maybe soften their positions so they can attract more voters. It also allows the voters to re-examine the candidates, the highest 2 vote getters. And they could say, I voted for Bob over Jane, but this time I like Jane better than Bob because they changed their position on something. They became a little bit more appealing than when they first ran. And also, it also deals with the issue of, say if you're going in an election where there's 10 candidates, you really like one of them. Maybe one's your cousin or your spouse, and you don't care for the rest of them. And say if that person doesn't win, well, you're not forced to then vote for these other 2 that win. So it gives the voter the option of participating or not. And lastly, of course, with runoff elections, they say, oh, the price tag is so expensive. Massachusetts has a $45 billion budget. Spending money on elections so that people are satisfied, it's simple, it's transparent, I think is a good use of our money. We don't know how much ranked choice voting will cost, getting the new machines in and getting it all counted in a central location. There's no, whatever the costs are, I'm sure they're going to be a wash. So I think there's other voting systems out there that deal with these problems that people experience from time to time that are a better solution than the one that's presented to the voters this November.
I'm going to take one more comment that actually supports what you're talking about here. In this ballot here, does the statement of fiscal consequences does state that because it's happening after January 1st, 2022, they don't know the government finances are, it says the government, state and municipal government finances are otherwise unknown. So they don't have a idea of how much this could cost. That is actually one of the things that they are saying. So this is being proposed and it doesn't have an exact number yet. So that's, I guess, in support of voting no. But one of the things I did want to do is just give you an opportunity to quickly summarize why someone should vote no on ranked choice voting.
It's simple. It's confusing.
That's all right. That's great. All right. Thank you so much, Paul.
More information from the Massachusetts Fiscal Alliance can be found online at massfiscal.org. Be sure to read your 2020 Statewide Ballot Questions booklet for the full information regarding Question 2. The PDF version is also available online on the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts website under the Elections and Voting section. Election Day is November 3rd. Early voting in Massachusetts is October 17th through the 30th. You can request a mail-in ballot through October 28th, but the U.S. Postal Service recommends you do so by October 20th. More information on voting specifically in Medfield can be found under the Town Clerk's page on the town website, town.medfield.net. There are multiple ways to vote, so make sure you do so if you're eligible. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of What's on the Ballot, brought to you by Medfield TV.